I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that we have so many people that are interested in water in this state. And of course, it's perhaps easy to run a meeting such as this after the year that we had this past year. Certainly, we all recognize that the joke is always that in Texas we plan for droughts by hoping that it'll rain, but clearly last year showed us that we have to do a little better than that. And that's what our purpose is tomorrow, and I'm glad that we will have a great turnout tomorrow. We're expecting more than 200 people that hopefully will begin a conversation about how we may better manage water in Texas. But tonight my role is different, and I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, who is Representative Mark Strama. Representative Strama is in his fourth term in the Texas House of Representatives. He chairs the House Committee on Technology, Economic Development, and Workforce, and serves on the Energy Resources Committee. And I think that's especially appropriate that we have someone that has been a real leader in energy policy in the state for our speaker, because you really don't have to delve very far into water issues to recognize that there is a true coupling between water and energy. Nationally, some 80% of the cost that we pay for water is moving it around, transporting it, a relatively energy-intensive effort to move it to where we need it. Plus the feasibility of some of the key technologies that we'll be talking about, particularly tomorrow afternoon after we've laid out availability and needs. Some of those key technologies, the feasibility of those technologies is dependent upon their energy usage and the costs of energy. Plus, on the other side, when we look at issues such as power plants, when we look at how we site power plants, water is really the number one issue. Is there access to water? So there's a true coupling between water and energy, and it's especially appropriate that we have Mark Strama to speak to us. His leadership in this area has been recognized for some time. He's been identified as one of the top legislators in Texas Monthly. He's been named one of the top 10 good men in American politics. Didn't know there was a top 10 good men, but that's great. He's been identified as Legislator of the Year by the Texas Renewable Energy Association, a Texas Technology Champion by Tech America, and a Legacy Award winner of the Texas Wind Coalition. I'd also like to identify that he serves on the advisory boards of the Clean Energy Incubator and the Environmental Sciences Institute at the University of Texas, and so we really appreciate your participation in those efforts. Finally, I'd like to recognize that Representative Strama is both a product of the Texas public school system and a strong advocate for public education, devoting substantial time and energy to its support. And I think that's especially important when we're looking at the issue of water and management of water in Texas, because we all recognize that the solution to these problems is not going to be something done in the back room. It's going to be something that involves the education of all the community, the entire public of Texas. And I think his leadership in that area is extremely important to that. So I can think of no one more appropriate to speak to us this evening, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming Representative Strama.
Thank you. I have to say, Danny's never met me before, so I don't know how he knows any of that is true. That was actually one of the that was not what I wrote in my introduction of myself. So that shows that he actually put some time into it, which never happens when I'm being introduced. They usually just read the stuff that's on my website. I have to say that was the second nicest introduction I've had in my time in politics. Can I take a minute and tell you all before I start talking about water about the first nicest introduction I ever had? It's a good story. So in my first campaign for office, I was passing out literature at the Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Pflugerville at their annual fall festival, and this woman comes up to me and she says, "You're Mark Strama. My daughter loves you. Can I take you to meet her?" And I said, "I don't know if you've heard, but Crystal and I are getting married really soon, and this is not," and she said, no, my daughter is 6 years old. And I thought, now why would a 6-year-old even know who the candidate for state representative is, much less care? Well, it turns out this little girl, her name's Hannah Malinowski, was learning to read in the middle of, as my campaign was getting underway and we were, putting yard signs in everybody's yards, and she's out walking in the neighborhood with her mom and dad one day, and she sees my sign in the neighbor's yard, and she sounds out my name. And this was a big accomplishment for a 6-year-old just learning to read. And her parents, being good parents who encouraged reading, heaped praise on her for figuring out what that combination of symbols spelled. And so every time Hannah would say my name, her parents would praise her. So she got this wonderful feeling in her heart about me. And so she'd walk around the house, Mark Strama this, Mark Strama that, Mark Strama, Mark Strama. And then one day she's watching television and one of my TV commercials came on. The same television set that the Cookie Monster and Elmo and all of her favorite people were on, there's me. And so now I'm bigger than life to this girl. She cannot understand what is going on here. So her mother brings me back to the corner of the activity center where Hannah and her friends were finger painting, and she taps Hannah on the shoulder and she says, "Hannah, look who I've got." And Hannah turns around, looks up, sees me, and her eyes get like this big, and she says, "Oh my gosh, it's Mark Strama." And this little 6-year-old girl next to her, finger painting with her, says, "Who's Mark Strama?" And Hannah looks at her friend and says, "I have no idea. But he's famous." I am honored to be with y'all tonight. I've got a sense that I'm in a room with a lot of intellectual horsepower, and so I'm pleased that y'all are taking on the issue of water. We have, and you can pick it up on the Texas Water Development Board's website very easily, a comprehensive state water plan. And it details, with a great degree of specificity, what this state can do to protect itself from the downside risk of a drought on the order of magnitude of the drought this state experienced in the 1950s, which we got a taste of last year. This state is currently populated by about 25 million people. By 2060, it'll be populated by about 46 million people. That growth will be concentrated primarily in about 30 counties, which aggravates the water development problem because it's got to be developed in specific areas where the consumption is going to be highest. There's a lot of literature out, especially in vogue right now, about the social utility of cities, of density, of concentrating creative minds together where there are synergistic effects of bringing them together. And I experienced this a little bit last year as we were wondering if it was ever going to rain again in Austin. It's A, miracle, and B, an incredible risk to live in a city. It's a miracle because you get to surround yourself by so many people with so much going on. You get exposure to such a diversity and breadth of experience and knowledge and culture. But honestly, it's ridiculous. If you compare it to the natural condition of humankind over the course of its history on Earth, it's completely dissimilar to the way we have habited this planet for most of our time on it. And it is ridiculous that we are able to drive our cars and turn on our water faucets and make the efficiency of the modern city work as seamlessly as it does. It's really nothing short of amazing. We take it, though, completely for granted. We never give it a second thought. You expect when you turn on the water that water is going to come out, and that you can drink it, for crying out loud, that you can drink it. Think about what a challenge drinking water has been for so much of our time on Earth, and still is for so many of the people on this planet. And we completely take it for granted. Our growth will be concentrated in 30 counties, which will have tremendous challenges meeting the resource needs of having everybody be able to take for granted that when they turn the faucet, drinkable water is going to come out. Our population will be up 82% in those 50 years, but water demand, interestingly, will only be up 22% during that time. That is largely because of assumptions the Water Development Board makes about technological innovation, investment in more efficient equipment in the agriculture sector, and because we will, as a consumerate, become more educated about the consequences of our consumption, and therefore hopefully more conservative about it. So we will go from 18 million acre feet per year to 22 million acre feet per year of water consumption, which a 22% increase relative to an 82% increase in population sounds like a good thing, but for the fact that that still creates a profound deficit in the amount of water we expect to have available to us if we don't take proactive action. Agriculture demand is assumed over that 50-year period to actually decrease, but municipal demand will nearly double. Meanwhile, existing water supplies, if nothing is done, are projected to decrease by 10%. So the State Water Plan articulates 562 specific projects that would essentially remediate that challenge, but at a cost of $53 billion in capital investment. And that is a high price tag. Somebody, actually it was Michael Weber, Dr. Weber over there, told me as we were talking through these remarks that, you know, we lead the nation in planning, but we haven't done anything with the plans. We have 562 articulated projects that we know we need to do if we're going to be prepared for these numbers that seem very well within the realm of likelihood. But we haven't funded hardly any of it, and we haven't even prioritized which ones we want to fund first. We know that we can get there, but we have to be aggressive to get there. It is going to take conservation and drought management and reservoirs and wells and water reuse and desalination and innovation in areas that policymakers haven't even thought about yet, but that I hope the folks who are going to be sharing deep thoughts here tomorrow are thinking about every minute of every day. It's going to take $53 billion to solve that problem, but the Water Development Board also calculated the consequences of not solving it. And here's the problem. We know it takes $53 billion to solve it. The fiscal consequence of not solving it is an unknown. They can put a dollar figure to it. They just can't tell you if it's going to happen. But if we don't address the looming shortfall between our water resources and our water consumption, the cost of a 1950s drought to Texas by the year 2060 would be $116 billion in 1 year and 1.1 million jobs lost. That, you would think, would be an actionable datum. You would think that that would prompt everyone to say, we have to do everything we can to avoid that. The problem is, that is only if you have a 1950s drought. So to some extent, the question is, what kind of a gambler are you? And we are a state with a reputation for wildcatting. And so I think it's necessary not just to point out the risk in terms of dollars and in terms of jobs, but to quote someone who is probably cliche to quote when you talk about water policy, to quote Thomas Malthus. And this is just really to scare the heck out of everybody, not because I necessarily agree with it. But Malthus in 1798 was describing the risks of population in excess of what our natural resources will support. And he said, the vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction. And after finishing their dreadful work themselves, they'll be followed in this war of extermination by sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague as they advance in terrific array and sweep off humans by the tens of thousands. Should success still be incomplete as the earth struggles to balance its population with its resources, gigantic, inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population of the food of the world. Malthus, writing in 1798, would never have contemplated the efficiency with which humankind now produces food. It is an incredible testament to markets, technology, and innovation. to industry, to human industry. But unlike food, water doesn't scale that way. Water is essentially a fixed amount. Malthus talked about the risk to human population in excess of the food we could generate, but he picked the wrong resource. The resource that poses the greatest threat to us is actually water. Because really, and if you didn't have this thought last year, if you were living in Austin during that drought, how could you not have thought to yourself sometimes, what if we don't have enough water? What if we get to the point where Lake Travis is dry and it just doesn't rain? Where am I going to get the water my children need to live if I can't get it out of the tap in my home? Because that's an actual problem in the year 2060 for this state. That's an actual problem before then, if we have a drought of record. Now, I'm going to say the things you expect somebody to say on this topic about conservation, but before I say them, I'm going to qualify it. As you heard a minute ago, I talk a lot about energy policy, and most advocates who share my values about energy policy are huge advocates for conservation. I'm actually not the biggest advocate in the world for conservation. And the reason for that is that in the energy field, there are alternatives to conservation. We are kind of by disposition gluttonous consumers of energy, and consuming energy is actually one of the biggest activities we do that creates prosperity. Access to energy is one of the single biggest determinants of the ability to create wealth and prosperity. So I'm not the biggest advocate of ratcheting down energy consumption. I'm an advocate instead of finding alternative, sustainable energy sources we can afford. Partly because high levels of consumption increase quality of life and standards of living, partly because you can't consume less than zero. You can't be more efficient than zero. And there are vast populations in the world, 1 billion people in China and 1 billion people in India, whose consumption on the grid today is essentially zero. And as they enter a level of prosperity where they can consume energy, electricity specifically, they cannot, through efficiency, reduce the footprint of that consumption on the planet. Efficiency will not do that. The only thing that will mitigate the ecological impact of those billions of people becoming consumers of energy is if we reduce the footprint of the energy itself. So that's different than what you typically hear about energy conservation. I say that so that I can now tell you with credibility all the things people typically say about water conservation, which is that we have to do it. And so I will tell you a story that, again, to quote Dr. Weber, I heard Dr. Weber tell this in a speech in front of the Austin Chamber of Commerce, and I've quoted it ever since. He talked about how he was brushing his teeth one day and had left the water running. This is a guy whose whole career is about water and energy. And his then 7-year-old, I think, daughter Evelyn, came to him and said, Daddy, you're wasting water, and you can't do that until the scientists solve the problem. And, he kind of, I am the scientist that's trying to solve the problem. And he said, and the other thing, Evelyn, is that it's really not people leaving the water running while they brush their teeth that's the problem with water consumption. The problem is we take the world's most precious resource and sprinkle it on our lawns so that we can grow the grass to a height that we can then take the world's second most precious resource to mow it down. And he observes that, 100 years from now, we look at people 100 years ago who tried to cure illnesses with leeches, right? 100 years from now, they're going to look at our putting water in our lawns and then using gasoline to mow it down, and they are going to say, what were those people thinking? Really, they're going to think we were crazy. So conservation has clearly got to be an element of any solution involving a finite resource. But the other thing that's going to have to be a part of the equation is policy. And that's an area where it's not unreasonable if you feel a little latent sense of despair. It's going to require a political system that elevates the common good above the other party's poor luck, bad politics. It's going to require people to think beyond sound bites. Nothing about this topic, as y'all are going to get deeper and deeper into it tomorrow, fits well on a bumper sticker. There isn't a bumper sticker that can educate the public about the challenges we face in water. But it is going to require political leadership, and we've seen some of that in Texas. Where did Robbie Cook go? Did he stay for my speech or did he leave? There he is. Robbie was a leader on water when he was in the Texas House, and he's been succeeded in that position, in that role, by other strong leaders like Representative Alan Ritter and Senator Kirk Watson. Representative Ritter, Chairman Ritter, and Senator Watson last session passed through the legislature, which required a 2/3 vote, and I think it got a unanimous vote, a proposed constitutional amendment that took a modest step toward creating a framework that encouraged landowners to conserve energy on their own land, to conserve water on their own land through reducing their tax appraisals if they did it, so reducing their tax burden. But it had in it some language that suggested an expansion of government decision-making over landowners' property rights. And it did do that. And because it had in it that language, it triggered a reaction from the Tea Party. And because it triggered that reaction, when it was put on the ballot for the voters to approve this constitutional amendment that I believe had passed unanimously, and that certainly wouldn't have been on the ballot without a 2/3 majority in each house, and that when I just looked on my iPad before giving this speech for some of the websites talking about why folks were against it, it took me 10 pages deep on the Google returns to find anything against it, because all of the mainstream editorials and all of the conventional mainstream views were so in favor of this constitutional amendment, but it was defeated at the polls by 8 points. And that was a reactionary backlash against, reflecting a deep-rooted suspicion of government's ability to solve problems. If we can't overcome that, we cannot meet the water challenges we face. And lastly, it is going to require R&D and innovation from the private sector and from academia. And that's why I'm really pleased at the focus that this conference has turned to this issue. My own background, before I got into politics, I started a company back when any bonehead with a business plan could make $1 billion in the internet. I thought I could be one of those boneheads. And I started the first company to enable people to fill out a voter registration form online. And in the 2000 election cycle, 700,000 Americans used that technology to register to vote. Which is to say, albeit immodestly, that at 33, I had registered more voters than Jesse Jackson. But I hadn't worked nearly as hard as he had to do it. If you think what it took to register 700,000 people to vote in the traditional way, think of all the volunteers and labor you would have to marshal. Think of the amount of shoe leather you would wear out going door to door and setting up tables on college campuses and at concerts and at any place where you could register voters. I had done it that way too. It's extraordinarily inefficient. With the internet, I was able to hire some college kids, pay them with pizza and beer, get them to write some code, put it on a server, and presto, 700,000 people registered to vote. Technology innovation has transformed so many of the world's marketplaces in the past 20 years, 30 years, but it has not been brought to bear, at least not to a sufficient extent, in the water marketplace and industry. And that's why it's encouraging that you're taking this on tomorrow, that we're bringing this caliber of intellect, and that you're convening industry leaders on this subject tomorrow, because we need the investments in R&D that we've seen transform information technology and hydraulic fracturing in the gas extraction field and in other areas of our society. We need that level of investment from industry and a partnership with the public sector to solve these problems in water. And I hope we will get there. I will close with some perspective on, my perspective on whether or not we have the political capacity to do that. When I got out of college, my first job out of college was working here in Austin for Ann Richards when she was running for governor in 1990 against Clayton Williams. And I'll be honest, it was my first job in politics. I didn't know anything about politics. I admired Ann Richards greatly, but quite honestly, I was terrified of her too. Any of you who knew Ann Richards will appreciate that that was a wise point of view on my part. So I spent most of the campaign trying to stay out of her line of sight and avoid, being exposed for the political ignoramus that I was at the time. And then I went and did all these other things, and then 14 years later, I came back and decided I wanted to run for state representative, and everybody told me the first thing you have to do is call Ann Richards and get her support. This was 2004, and she was still at that time the most important member of my political party in this state. And I knew they were right, but I also knew that at the age of 36, I was as terrified of Ann Richards as I had been when I was 22. And so reluctantly, I picked up the phone and called her and told her I was running for office, and I asked her if she would support me. And she was very stern on the other end of the phone. She said, "Mark, why are you doing this?" And because I was nervous, I launched into my entire stump speech. I started telling her everything that I care about and all of the issues that I wanted to work on and all of the ways that I was sure I could make a difference if I was elected. I poured all of my passion and idealism into this way too lengthy soliloquy. And when I finally ran out of breath, there was 5 seconds of silence on the other end of the phone, and then for the first time in all the time that I'd known her, Ann Richards softened up toward me. And she said, "Oh, sweetie, that may be the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life." She said, "The only smart reason to run for office is because you can win. So why don't you tell me how you plan to win?" Which sounds cynical. But in fact, what she was trying to teach me is that you should be animated to enter politics because of a passion and an idealism and a vision. But at the end of the day, you make no progress toward those goals if you don't also have a practical understanding of how the system works and how to advance the ball incrementally toward those goals. And that's the most valuable lesson there is in politics, because it's the art of the possible. Mark Twain said, "Everybody always talks about the weather, but nobody ever does anything about it." So I'm hoping that tomorrow, as you guys think about this, I hope you can figure out how to do something about it, and I'll be looking forward to the results. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much. I think those are stirring words, and I think we are left with a real challenge. How tomorrow are we going to set the stage to win? Thank you again. Join me in thanking Mark Strama.